I'll be presenting you a portion of my thesis titled Seismic-Based Characterization of a Carbonate Gas Storage Reservoir Assisted by Unsupervised Machine Learning. My name is Clayton Silver, and my advisor is Dr. Heather Beadle, and my committee members are Dr. Matthew Pranner and Dr. Matthew Ryan. So getting into the motivation for my thesis, we want to understand how natural or gas storage reservoirs, because they are a key component to keeping everyday life normal in regions with harsh winters. So here's a little data set showing the fluctuations of natural gas working storage levels, and you can see just how they withdraw around 1,000 to 1,500 to 2,000 BCF of natural gas every winter, and then whenever demand is high. And then during the warmer months, when people aren't heating their homes, using as much energy to heat their homes, energy companies can utilize the lower average costs to increase their storage values for the next following winter. So understanding, oh, my computer's freaking out. So natural gas storage is a very important aspect of life up in the northern regions. And then also these pinnacle reefs up in the Michigan Basin are currently being researched for carbon dioxide sequestration efforts to combat the global warming effect, in addition to EOR efforts. And so a recent DOE project has identified just through 82 reefs can store 51 million tons of carbon dioxide. And that was just targeting this northern trend here. And so just seeing the wealth of potential reservoir targets in this basin warrants a very good understanding or research into understanding the spatial reservoir properties to ensure we maximize the storage capacity of each Pinnacle Reef reservoir. And the challenges we face in understanding these reservoirs is that carbonate environments are inherently heterogeneous. So this cartoon shows what just the scale of heterogeneity we can encounter in these outer ramp environment of depositions. And so you can see on the vertical scale, we can have heterogeneities on the scale of 1 meter to a foot. But spatially, they're slightly less heterogeneous and can be consistent or pretty consistent over the scales of tens of meters. And so while well log data provides excellent vertical resolution to resolve these small scale vertical heterogeneities, they typically struggle at the lateral resolution, as they're pretty much point source data, laterally speaking. And so the interpolation of these properties and facies are inherently dependent on the geostatistical techniques employed. And seismic data can improve this by the fact that it has great lateral resolution in comparison. However, it does have poor vertical resolution. So the three main study questions I want to answer today are, can unsupervised machine learning methods, specifically the generative topographic map, classify seismic facies within a Pinnacle Reef reservoir utilizing post-stack seismic attributes, which we can correlate to lithology. Following that, we want to investigate whether pre-stack inversion is viable in these reservoirs, and also can pre-stack inversion help quantify reservoir porosity within this Niagaran Pinnacle Reef reservoir. And lastly, we want to investigate how does quantification of the properties predicted from seismic data compared to those from previous geostatistical well models. So to get into the study area, we are looking at the Ray Reef field in the Michigan Basin, and that's located here in this little thumb of the state of Michigan on the eastern side. And so we have a 10 square mile 3D seismic survey in addition to 86 wells. The well data is severely lacking, as this is a legacy field that was first identified in 1959 and has been converted to gas storage since the 1970s. And so the majority of these wells primarily just have gamma ray or neutron count, or sometimes even several of them don't even have any logs. We have 7 wells with sonic logs and 7 wells with density logs, and 15 of these wells have been cored. And the seismic data, the seismic survey for this study was cropped down to the extents of the reef, as we aren't too concerned with the surrounding lithologies. And it's important to note that there are no shear logs available in this data set. So all shear logs were, used for seismic inversion attempts were predicted. At the reservoir interval, we have a resolution of 40 feet. And to give an idea of the reservoir thickness, on average, the reef is anywhere from 200 to 300 feet thick. So to get into the to understand how these reefs formed, we have to understand where the North American continent was at this time. So at the Silurian, in the mid-Silurian, 430 million years ago, the North America was around 10 to 20 degrees south of the equator. And the Michigan Basin was this sort of round, shallow sea. And Ryan et al. In 2020 provides a geochemistry and biostratigraphy constrained model for the development of these pinnacle reefs in the Michigan Basin. And it's important to understand the process of how these reefs evolved and grew through time, as that has a direct control on the properties of the reservoir. And so a series of high frequency and high amplitude sea level fluctuations resulted in rapid sedimentation and growth of these carbonate reefs. They initialized as a deep water mud mound on the outer ramp basinward of the shelf slope. And through a series of sea level fluctuations, even the bioherms were potentially exposed depending on their location in the basin. And then a rapid growth or explosion of these stromatoporoid pinnacle or reef building organisms played keep up or catch up with the rising sea level. And then a period of isolation of the Michigan Basin from outside water sources resulted in hypersaline and restricted depositions and the deposition of several thick salt evaporite units that laterally encase these reefs. And so to understand the facies that were deposited during these rapid growth periods, Ryan et al. In 2017 provides a robust facies model that was constructed by analyzing several storage reservoirs along the southern reef trend. And their findings show that these reefs are asymmetric, and their growth were influenced by paleo wind direction. And the windward side is typically steep, with windward talus and debris flows limited to fairly close to the reef. And we have the reef core with an onlapping reef apron that is primarily grainstones that gradually thins out into a distal reef apron. During the peritidal sequence of these reef growth of these reefs, a stromatolite cap was deposited and subaerially exposed, resulting in an unconformity that's pretty consistently found throughout the top of the reef core. And lastly, the peritidal A1 carbonate was deposited following a rise in sea level, and then they were capped by the A2 anhydrite and the A2 salt. So to get into some of the methods used, the generative topographic mapping is a nonlinear dimensional reduction technique. And so the GTM algorithm employs a manifold that is represented in 2D latent space by these grid points, and these basis functions help map these grid points to the multi-dimensional or d-dimensional data space. And so then a radially symmetric Gaussian function is centered around these node points here, and PDFs for the data vectors are summed through each iteration to try to calculate the distance or minimize the distance of data points to this manifold. And through multiple iterations, this manifold is iteratively deformed through an expectation maximum algorithm until either the number of iterations are reached or the manifold cannot be deformed any further to maximize the distances between the data points. And so to visualize these classifications, we can calculate the probability of these data vectors lying, or these nodes lying within the deformed manifold, and then process that back to latent space and extract the x coordinates and y coordinates as separate volumes and cross plot for classification of seismic facies. And to get into the to show you all exactly how this works, we can start with a 2D example. And so here are our data points in a 2D data space. And for iteration 1, we define that these Gaussian centers fall along the first eigenvector. And through each iterations, we aim to shrink the Gaussian centers, but deform the manifold to best fit this data. And this continues throughout until the expectation can no longer be maximized by further deformation of this manifold. And then we can calculate the probabilities of these data points lying within these Gaussian centers and extract those probabilities to the x and y coordinate in latent space and cross-plot those values for classification of the facies. And then for pre-stack seismic inversion, seismic inversion is trying to go from the amplitude to geology. So the seismic inversion incorporates both the well data and the seismic data, where the well logs are passed through a low pass filter and combined with the seismic horizons to construct low frequency background models. We do this because seismic data is band limited and is typically missing the lower frequencies. And this is also starts as a starting point for the model-based inversion method used. During the inversion, the low frequency background models are used as an initial best guess, and the traces are iteratively changed using the pre-stack seismic angle gathers to help solve the Zopert's approximation equations used, such as the Fatty's equation, Fatty et al.'s approximation, to solve for elastic properties such as P impedance, S impedance, and the VP-VS ratio. We can then use these elastic properties to construct attributes such as lambda rho, mu rho, that we can use to in our analysis to classify porosity and also lithology. So the lambda rho, mu rho attributes that are used in this study were first proposed by Goodway et al. In 1997. And they incorporate the Lemay constants of compressibility and rigidity. The lambda Lemay constant is representative of the compressional resistance to being compressed. So this is influenced by both the P and S impedance, and is more prone to illuminating fluid effects, such as ship anomalies caused by gas or oil within the pore space. Whereas the parameter of rigidity is entirely dependent on the S impedance. And so this will not be as susceptible to fluid contents, as shear waves cannot be or travel through liquids or gases. And it's important to note with these attributes, we're not calculating or creating any new data necessarily, as we're squaring the P and S impedances. But what it does allow us is to analyze these data and anomalies with a larger separation between values. And also previous studies have proposed templates that where different lithologies, porosities, and fluids will plot within the lambda rho, mu rho data space. And so now I'll present my first study. This is the applications of generative topographic maps on post-stack data to enhance carbonate reservoir characterization. So the overall workflow for this study is first we compute our volume attributes, and for that we did spectral decomposition and calculated instantaneous attributes as well. These were input to the GTM volumetric classification workflow, and then from there we iteratively classify the seismic facies using cross-plotting of the projection vectors and correlating these classifications with well data. This part was done iteratively to come up with the best classification from the GTM classification. So we use cosine of instantaneous phase, as this is amplitude independent and can also emphasize stratigraphic continuity. And the cosine of instantaneous phase was used specifically to avoid non-cyclical values, to avoid misclassification of data values at the near endpoints of like negative 180 and 180 degrees. Instantaneous frequency was also used, as it is the time derivative of instantaneous phase, and low instantaneous frequencies have been shown to correlate with porous zones within Niagaran pinnacle reefs along the northern reef trend. Spectral decomposition was also used. A continuous wavelet transform algorithm was done, as it was noted that the spectral decomposition revealed several different varying frequencies that showed strong responses in the frequency domain, and they each revealed different characteristics of the reef. The 24 hertz provided a more smooth and more smooth response with a strong response in the northern reef, and the 53 hertz provided a weak response in the margin with some heterogeneity present within the reef. Finally, the 86 hertz was featured a strong response, a strong patchy heterogeneous response within the central reef. And to get into the observations made, here are some cross sections and some map slices presented through the central part of the reservoir. And so we can see the amplitude doesn't really provide us much information. However, the cosine of instantaneous phase highlights some internal, some stratigraphic discontinuities within the central part of the reef. And the reef is primarily represented as a positive value of cosine of instantaneous phase. The instantaneous frequency reveals some very high frequency response within the central portion of the reef, whereas the northern portion of the reef typically exhibits a lower instantaneous frequency values. And here in the spectral decomposition isofrequency slices, we can see the lower frequency captures more of a smoother general trend, whereas the higher frequencies capture patchy, more heterogeneous responses. Here's the final classified volume that was classified correlating to core data. And so we can see here this well R107 in the northern part of the reef, we have the entire reef interval is cored. And we can see the peritidal corresponds to this green facies, whereas the reef core is identified as this blue one. And we can see there are possibly 3 different sort of reef core complexes that amalgamated through time. And so these were likely initiated on 3 separate bioherms and then grew together as the reef experienced its rapid growth. It's important to note that the bioherm is not differentiated well from the apron facies. So we're getting a lot of these two mixed together pretty well. And we can see in this R101 well that was drilled in the flank that there's pretty poor correlation or differentiation between these two. So going forward, since the reef core is classified the best, we conducted a further analysis by extracting a reef core geobody from the discretized SegY volume, classified SegY volume. And so from there, we can calculate a reef core isochord using a constant interval thickness. And so using an interval thickness of 19,000 feet per second, we can see that there are several different anomalously thick zones within the southern, central, and northern portion of the reef. And comparing this to the average absolute open flow map, and this is a measure of how the wells perform that is independent of the back pressure at the surface. And we can see that some of these thickness values correlate pretty well with these higher absolute average open flow zones. And from this, we can see that this thick value here north of R118 has no wells. No wells have been drilled here and could be a potential missed opportunity for a high performance gas storage zone. So going forward, and here now present the applications of the pre-stack inversion on a Silurian pinnacle reef gas storage reservoir for enhanced geologic interpretations. To get into, so as I mentioned earlier, no shear logs are present in this data set. So the shear logs were estimated using the Zhu equation, and we followed the same workflow presented in Sams et al., where the macro and micro porosity were assigned different aspect ratios and incorporated into the S-wave prediction. Missing density and velocity logs were estimated using Gardner's relationship. While this is relatively simple, it did provide a decent result, and we unfortunately have no way to really ground truth either of these predictions. So to analyze, to get an idea of what the pre-stack seismic inversion will show us, we looked at a series of well log cross plots. And starting in this well 24224, this is located off the reef and has a measured sonic and density log. And by cross-plotting the calculated P impedance and P wave velocity, we can see we can separate and classify the salt units very well from the carbonate units. Moving into a cord well within the reservoir that also has a measured sonic log, we cross-plotted the VPS ratio versus P impedance to see if there's any relationship between these elastic properties and porosity. And we can see that that low P impedance values combined with low VPVS values correspond to some of the most porous zones within the reservoir, whereas fairly high P impedance values correlate well with tight water saturated zones within the reservoir. So from this, we observe we have the potential to identify porous zones and also lithology from the inversion results. Oh, my compute, there we go. So looking at the pre-stack seismic conversion result, here's the comparison between the amplitude and the inverted P impedance volume. And through this slice, we can see there's a very good match within R117. However, the R115 and some parts of the R310 wells are the P impedance volume seems to slightly under predict some of these trends. And this may be due to the log estimation used for density in these and velocity in these wells respectively. In addition to, there could also be fluid effects in the velocity logs as well. We just really aren't sure. But using the equations discussed previously, the P impedance and S impedance volumes were used to calculate the lambda rho and mu rho volumes. And so here on the left, we have a horizon slice through each volume at approximately this dashed white interval. And we can observe that the southern part of the reef typically has higher lambda rho and higher mu rho than the central and northern portions of the reef. In addition, also, there appears to be a stratified distribution of low lambda rho and moderate to high lambda rho within the reef, whereas the mu rho is fairly consistent low to mid values in the central and northern part of the reef. And so by first interpreting the P impedance result by using core data as our guide, and in addition to the geologic model proposed by Ryan et al., we can make some direct interpretations from the P impedance volume of possible depositional environment facies. So the reef core is typically characterized from low to mid values overlying this very high impedance zone that is interpreted to be the tight water saturated bioherm. As we go off to the west, we can see an onlapping band of low impedance values, and this is interpreted to be the leeward proximal apron. Lastly, we can observe a thin high impedance zone that's somewhat patchy on the capping the top of the reef. And this is interpreted to be the A2 anhydrite with the very thin band underneath being the A1 carbonate. We can also see some semicircular depressions within the reef that are interpreted to be possible locations of karst or collapse features caused by subaerial exposure of the reef complex. The reef talus is also not identified by the seismic data, likely due to the steeply dipping reflectors here. So going into the Lambda Rho Mu Rho classification for porosity, we used the guide by Hoff et al. 2008 to guide our classifications in addition to and confirming these with well data. So we can see that the dolomite and limestone or carbonate lithology should plot within this zone here. And as we move down towards the zero or the zero axis, porosity should increase. And as we move left, that suggests a shift from water to gas, as Lambda Rho is primarily affected by these fluid fluctuations. So here's the cross plot of the Mu Rho and Lambda Rho, and these user-defined polygons represent the classification of data points into discrete classes or facies. And this horizon slice here is 5 milliseconds below the top of the Gulf formation or the top of the reef, and is represented by the white line. And we can see we have a fairly patchy distribution of the good porosity facies, which is classified as greater than 10%, and also a somewhat stratified a somewhat stratified classification of the fair porosity, which is 5 to 10%, and the poor and tight porosity dominate the gas water contact and below. And so the key takeaways from this is that the overall trends are captured well by the seismic data, as the high porosity and possible gas saturated zones correlate with very high porosity zones within the reservoir, whereas below the gas water contact, the trends are not matched as well. As we can see in this R109, we have fairly good porosity, however, is classified as very tight to no porosity. So correlating the classification in this study to previous studies, we can see that the Wold's 2008 model, well-based model of Ray Reef, used a sequence stratigraphy approach to quantify and spatially estimate petrophysical properties such as porosity. And so that approach resulted in fairly stratified, spatially or laterally continuous and vertically discontinuous layers of good and low porosity. Haney in 2009 used a petrofacies approach where she classified her facies model based on units with similar petrophysical and lithological properties. She then biased her petrophysical properties and used a series of variogram analysis to spatially extrapolate and constrain the petrophysical properties to her well data. And this resulted in a very patchy and heterogeneous distribution of high porosity zones with but also a fairly continuous distribution of porosity greater than 10%. And this approach accurately represents the heterogeneity present within this dolomitic reservoir. This study has elements of both of these models present within it. We have a fairly a stratified response of good to fair porosity, and in addition to lower porosity or limited amount of good porous zones within the bioherm, similar to the findings in the two previous studies. It is, however, important to note that the resolution of the seismic data does, and the deterministic inversion method does inhibit this model's ability to capture the small scale heterogeneity present within Ray Reef. So to continue our analysis and to quantify and try to understand how the porosity model compares to well data, we computed the a storage thickness map of Ray Reef using the porosity model previously shown. Geobodies similar to the GTM workflow were extracted from the high and fair porosity zones, and isochore maps were calculated for each using the same constant interval velocity of 19,000 feet per second. And then the thickness values were multiplied by their respective classes porosity. 10% and 7.5% was used for the fair porosity facies. And this is the resulting map. And so this is the units here are storage height, or really how much pore space is present within this interval. And to quantify the error in this, we calculated the average storage capacity or pore height within each cored well in Ray Reef. And so we can see that some of these extreme error values are due to either the wells not being completely cored, as is the case in this R119, and then in R108, this well here on the reef flank severely underestimates the porosity as and this is due to the steeply dipping reflectors here, just this and the seismic data just not being able to accurately represent and resolve those features. And then again, here in R301, this well, only 130 feet of the 310 feet of reservoir encounter were cored. So interpreting these results, we can see, and by analyzing core data, we can see the southern portion of the reef could potentially be prone to salt plugging, as this R121 well exhibits a high amount of salt plugging observed in core. The porous windward talus in this R118 well is, while underestimated, the linear extent is captured in this case. Whereas on the R102 and R105, the storage height is severely underestimated. And so we are likely severely underestimating the storage capacity of the windward talus in this region on the windward side. So the conclusions for this study are that the pre-stack inversion allows for qualitative interpretation of depositional facies directly from the impedance volume. The lambda rho mu rho cross plot quantified porosity from seismic data and provides and can be used to calculate storage capacity using a constant interval velocity and porosity values for each defined or classified facies. So going back to our study questions, unsupervised machine learning of identified seismic facies which can correlate to the peritidal and reef core complexes respectively that were identified in the core analysis. However, it did fail to differentiate the bioherm from the apron talus and reef facies. Pre-stack inversion attributes are definitely a viable investment for quantifying reservoir porosity, possible lithology changes within Niagara and Pinnacle Reef reservoirs. These inversion attributes also allow for valuable reservoir maps such as storage capacity and porosity distribution. Lastly, the comparison of the seismic porosity model to the previous well-based porosity models captured similar global trends observed in both of them. However, the geostatistical well-based models model the heterogeneity present within this dolomitic reservoir much more accurately. So for future steps and pitfalls to keep in mind for the study is that in future work, stochastic inversion methods would be much better to honor and represent the heterogeneity present in this study. The deterministic model-based inversion provides the single best answer to the inversion problem, whereas the stochastic inversion workflow would provide you with a measure of uncertainty. Constructing a robust TDR was a challenge faced throughout the study and severely limited the scope of the analysis possible, as many of the cored wells used in this study use a simple or shared time-depth relationship, resulting in ambiguity of the interpretations. Shear log prediction was also another ambiguity, as we were unable to ground truth our predicted logs used for our inversion. Future work in this could possibly be training neural networks on shear logs present elsewhere in the basin and applying it to Ray Reef. Also, the challenge of capturing the data within the steeply dipping windward and even in the leeward reef flanks. Trying to solve that question is also a very challenging prospect. And also for future workflows is to validate these workflows on other Niagara Pinnacle reefs in Michigan Basin to analyze how effective they are on other possibly smaller pinnacle reefs. Here are my references. And I would like to thank Consumers Energy for providing the data, seismic and well data for this study, Schlumberger for Petrel licenses, Sound QI for their cross-plotting software, the Subsurface Detective Agency and ASPE consortiums for sponsoring and funding this research. And lastly, Hampson Russell and CGG for the inversion and well log and for the software used for the inversion and well log analysis. I could not thank Dr. Beadle enough. She's been incredible throughout my time here. In addition to all the members of the SDA and ASPE, I've had an incredible experience, and it would not have been the same without all of you guys here. And lastly, my family. You've kept me going through this. Dad, thanks for showing me Wally the Wavelet in 3rd grade and inspiring me to continue the family tradition of being a geoscientist. And my brothers for always being there and supporting me. And lastly, most importantly, my fiance Hope, I love you. And I cannot thank you enough for your patience throughout this. And so, yeah, now I'll take questions.
Thank you, Clayton. We can open it up. You can either ask away or raise your hand and I could call on you.
So in here, I assume when you look at the quality of storage quantity, it's primarily